the temp nurse from the discount agency. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her during morning briefing, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt usually reserved for hospital waste. Rachel Torres heard it. Everyone heard it. The ER staff exchanged glances, the kind that said they'd seen this before, and she was about to learn what it meant to be beneath his notice. What they didn't know was that she'd held intestines in her hands while mortars shook the building around her. What Hargrove had no idea was that the woman checking the supply closet inventory had operated on 47 patients in a single day at FOB Lejeune, Helmand Province, with nothing but saline solution and muscle memory keeping people alive. But Rachel kept her head down. She always did. That was the deal she'd made with herself 20 years ago when she walked away from everything. Mercy General's emergency department smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, that particular combination that never quite washed out of the walls. Rachel moved through the chaos of the Wednesday morning shift like she was made of glass, her blonde hair pulled tight enough to make her scalp ache, her scrubs still crisp from the package because she'd bought them yesterday at 11 p.m. when she realized she owned nothing appropriate for civilian work. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that way that triggered something in her chest, a sound that was almost like the electrical whine of field medical equipment running on generator power. She pushed it down. Just a sound. Just a hospital. Just her first day. Room 4. The name on the patient board made her stop. Marcus Davis. Age 16. Paralyzed from T6 down. Admitted for observation. Seizure activity reported. The surname hit her in a place she'd locked away, and her right hand moved to her left wrist before she could think about it. The scar there was thin now, barely visible beneath her watch, but she felt it the way amputees feel phantom limbs. 20 years. It had been exactly 20 years since Marja. Exactly 20 years since she'd stood in a surgical tent with mortar rounds walking toward her position, operating on a young Marine with shrapnel in his abdomen while the building shook. She didn't remember his face anymore, that was how trauma worked, it erased the details that mattered most, but she remembered the name. Davis. Sergeant Major Robert Davis. She remembered his blood on her hands. She closed her eyes. Opened them. Read the rest of the board. Got a problem. Dr. Hargrove materialized beside her the way predators do, without sound, just sudden presence. His shoes were Italian leather, expensive enough that the squeak of them on the linoleum sounded like money. She turned to face him, and his smirk was already in place, the expression of someone who'd already decided what you were before you opened your mouth. His jaw was the kind that looked carved from marble, and his silver hair was styled with enough precision to suggest he spent actual time on it. Everything about him communicated power, or at least his version of it, the kind that came from institutional position rather than earned competence. "No, Doctor," Rachel said. Her voice came out soft, careful. The voice of someone asking permission to exist. "Just reviewing room assignments." "Well, the assignments aren't your concern yet. You're observing. Stay out of the way. Don't touch anything that requires a judgment call. And try not to embarrass yourself before noon." He walked away before she could respond, his presence departing like a storm moving to find other buildings to damage. Rachel exhaled slowly. Held it. Counted to 4. Exhaled for 6. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and whatever institutional protein they decided to serve today. Rachel was standing in line, her tray balanced on one hand, when Dr. Hargrove came around the corner moving fast enough that the collision wasn't accidental. His shoulder caught her tray like a deliberate check into the boards, and coffee exploded across her chest, soaking through her scrubs in a dark stain that looked like a map of somewhere she'd rather not remember. The cup clattered on the tile. Hot liquid dripped from her collarbone. The entire cafeteria went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had turned down the volume on the world. 30 people. Maybe 40. All watching to see how the temp nurse would react to being publicly humiliated. Rachel set down her tray. Her hands were steady. She looked at them for a moment, the trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind of control that came from having learned long ago that flinching only made things worse. She grabbed a napkin from the dispenser and began cleaning the coffee from her scrubs, her movements precise and unhurried. "That was sloppy," Hargrove said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Paid attention in your training, or did they skip the collision avoidance module at Quickstaff Solutions?" A few people laughed, the nervous laughter of subordinates following a superior's lead. One of the residents actually smiled, like he was making a mental note to do the same thing tomorrow. Rachel didn't respond. She finished with the napkins, tossed them in the trash, and picked up her tray. She could feel the eyes on her back as she moved to the exit. Could feel the assessment happening. Is she going to cry? Is she going to argue? Is she going to file a complaint? Is she made of anything at all, or is she exactly what Hargrove said she was? She was almost to the hallway when it happened. Hargrove appeared in front of her, moving fast, and he plucked a patient chart from the stack at the nearby nurse station. Without breaking eye contact with Rachel, he tossed it at her feet. Not dropped it. Not set it down. Tossed it with a casual flick of a wrist that suggested this was something he'd practiced. The chart scattered across the linoleum, papers fanning out like he'd sown seeds. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice carried a rasp, like he'd spent the morning smoking cigarettes and making people uncomfortable. "Maybe you can actually read it, given how much extra time that'll give you." The room held its breath. Rachel could feel it, the collective intake of air, the waiting to see if she would break. If she would cry. If she would run. If she would, finally, confirm that she was exactly the nothing that Hargrove had announced to the entire ER staff 4 hours ago. She bent down. Slow. Deliberate. Not beaten, not humiliated, but present in a way that made clear she'd made a choice. She gathered the papers, organized them back into sequence, chart notes first, then labs, then imaging results, and straightened. When she looked up at Hargrove, her eyes were flat. Not angry. Not tearful. Flat in the way that eyes get when they've seen things that couldn't be unseen. "I've held intestines in steady hands during mortar fire, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost the careful softness. "Your disrespect won't even make me flinch." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Long enough for him to feel the weight of something he couldn't name. Long enough for her to see his smirk falter, just slightly, just enough to know that he'd felt it too, the presence of something in her that didn't match the temp nurse from the discount agency. Then she straightened the chart she was holding and walked down the hallway without looking back. Her scrubs were still stained with coffee. Her hands were still steady. And in her locker, wrapped in an old ACU jacket, sat a pair of worn Marine combat boots that had never left her in 20 years, waiting for something she couldn't quite name. The silence behind her lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the cafeteria began to move again, conversations resuming like they'd never stopped, but something had changed. Hargrove was still standing in the same spot, looking at the space where she'd been, and his expression had shifted into something closer to calculation. The temp nurse had just revealed herself to be something other than temporary, and he would remember that. The morning rounds at Mercy General began at 7 o'clock sharp, and Dr. Hargrove timed them like surgical incisions, precise, intentional, and designed to cause maximum exposure. Rachel stood at the back of the gathering, clipboard pressed against her chest like armor, watching as Hargrove positioned himself at the center of the ER nursing station. 12 staff members circled him, nurses, residents, 2 medical students fresh enough to laugh at his jokes. The fluorescent lights cast everything in hard white, making shadows under eyes look like bruises. "Good morning, everyone," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been questioned in his own territory. "Before we begin, I want to introduce our newest addition." He turned, and his gaze locked on Rachel with the precision of a spotlight. "This is our temp nurse from, what was it called, Quickstaff Solutions. The discount agency we contacted when budget constraints became, shall we say, unavoidable." He smiled. Not the smile of welcome. The smile of a surgeon identifying where to cut. "Everyone, please make her feel temporary." The laughter came like a reflex. A few nurses glanced at Rachel with expressions that ranged from sympathetic to predatory. One of the medical students elbowed the other. Rachel's fingers tightened on the clipboard. She took one measured breath through her nose, the kind of breath she'd learned in 23 years of controlled chaos, and met Hargrove's eyes without blinking. Her face remained a smooth surface of professional courtesy. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "Let's begin with room 3, Hargrove continued, breaking eye contact first. He moved down the corridor with the group trailing behind him, and Rachel followed at the edge of the formation, becoming the shadow of the shadow. The rounds lasted 40 minutes. Hargrove spoke to the other physicians and residents, barely acknowledging Rachel except when he needed someone to fetch something, another patient's chart, a monitor reading, a coffee he'd changed his mind about ordering. By the time they finished at 7:16 a.m., she'd been sent back to the station 3 times for tasks that could have waited. A resident had offered to help the second time. Hargrove had waved him off with a single gesture. Let her learn her way around. The humiliation was surgical. Precise. Designed to be witnessed. At noon, Rachel walked into the cafeteria with her shift halfway done and her stomach empty since 5 a.m. She'd kept her head down through the morning, completed every task assigned, and stayed in the background of every interaction. The strategy was simple, invisibility was safety. She grabbed a tray, salad, crackers, bottled water, and turned to find an empty table away from the physician's corner. Hargrove sat with 3 other doctors, Dr. Chen, Dr. Okafor, and Dr. Stevens. They were deep in conversation about a patient's prognosis when Rachel passed their table. She was careful. She'd learned to move through hostile spaces without drawing attention, a skill honed over countless deployments where noticing you existed could mean noticing you died. Her tray was steady. Her steps were measured. He extended his foot at the exact moment her left foot came forward. Her body tried to compensate, the muscle memory of 2 decades kicking in, telling her legs to correct, to flow, to recover. But the angle was designed too perfectly. Her right hip twisted. The tray tilted. Water splashed first, then the salad went everywhere, and the coffee, a full cup of dark, steaming coffee, cascaded across the front of her white scrubs in a dark wave that spread like blood across gauze. The cafeteria went silent. Absolutely silent. The kind of silence that comes when violence happens and no one moves. Rachel set the tray down on a nearby table with steady hands. Her scrubs dripped. The stain spread across her left side like a dark map of humiliation. She didn't look at Hargrove. She pulled napkins from the dispenser on the wall, one stack, then another, and began dabbing at the stain with the mechanical precision of someone removing evidence from a crime scene. One tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it away without breaking her own internal rhythm, the same way she'd once wiped blood from her hands after clamping an artery while the operating tent shook from mortar rounds. Dr. Chen half rose from his chair, some instinct of decency rising to the surface. Hargrove placed a hand on his colleague's arm. "She's fine," Hargrove said loudly, ensuring the entire cafeteria heard his performance. "Aren't you, sweetheart? Careful there, Butterfingers. Maybe stick to bedpans until you master something more complex. Walking, for instance." Rachel looked up from her scrubs. Her hand stopped moving. She met Hargrove's eyes with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how much worse things can be. "I've held intestines in steady hands during mortar fire, Doctor," she said quietly. Soft enough that only those closest could hear. Loud enough that everyone listened anyway. "Your disrespect won't even make me flinch." His smirk faltered for half a second, just long enough for Rachel to see the calculation reset behind his eyes. She'd said something unexpected. Something that didn't fit the script he'd written for her. She turned and walked to the restroom without waiting for a response, leaving the wet scrubs and the scattered food and the watching faces behind her. The door swung shut with a soft click against the frame. In the bathroom, alone, Rachel gripped the edge of the sink and exhaled. Her hand shook. Actually shook, a tremor that started in her shoulders and traveled down to her fingertips like aftershock. She'd given him something, a thread of truth that he could pull on, and he would pull. He wasn't finished calculating yet. The next morning, the final humiliation arrived with surgical precision. Rachel pushed the medication cart down the hallway at 11 a.m., restocking supplies, when Hargrove emerged from the nursing station holding Marcus Davis's chart. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He released the chart at exactly the moment her hands were occupied, and it fell to the tile floor with the sound of paper hitting hard ground. The pages scattered. Charts and notes and vital signs scattered everywhere like white leaves. The entire nursing station watched. "Pick that up, sweetheart, maybe you can actually read it." His voice was pleasant, conversational, the tone of a man giving helpful advice. "Though I doubt they taught medical terminology at your agency school. Let's see if you figured out what elevated intracranial pressure trends actually mean when you see them in a chart." Rachel stopped the cart. A resident named Dr. Park moved toward the scattered pages with the instinct of someone who knew she needed help. Hargrove raised one hand, a gesture so small it was almost unnoticeable to anyone not trained to read violence in body language. "No, no," he said gently. "Let her learn her place." Rachel bent down. One by one, she gathered the pages. Her hair fell forward, concealing her face. The humiliation was designed that way, public but not theatrical, deniable but impossible to ignore. She collected the chart methodically, restoring order to chaos, her movements precise and deliberate. The other nurses watched. The residents watched. Hargrove watched with the expression of a man whose strategy was working perfectly. She stood, chart reconstructed, and extended it back to him. Their eyes met for the first time since the cafeteria, and something flickered in Hargrove's expression, a recognition, maybe, that she wasn't breaking. "The chart shows elevated intracranial pressure trends you've missed for 3 days, Doctor," Rachel said, her voice steady and clinical. "His pupils are becoming sluggish. Continued trajectory suggests increased herniation risk without intervention." The nursing station went quiet. Hargrove's face darkened. The smile vanished. He straightened, his jaw clenching, and something shifted in his eyes, in not anger yet, but the precursor to it. Calculation turning into something more dangerous. "My office." "Now," he said quietly. Rachel followed him down the corridor, past the patient rooms, past the supply closets, to the small office where he closed the door with deliberate softness. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed, and for a moment he simply studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that wasn't supposed to have a solution. "I made a bet with the chief of medicine," he said finally. "You'll quit within a week. That's my prediction. Everyone at this hospital, everyone I've trained, everyone I've mentored over 16 years, they all believe in my judgment." He paused. "I've made a professional reputation out of being right about people. And I'm right about you. You don't belong here, and you know it. My suggestion, don't make me look bad by lasting longer than you're supposed to." Rachel said nothing. She turned and walked out, closing the door behind her quietly. It wasn't until she reached the stairwell, alone in the concrete silence 3 flights below the main floor, that her hands began to shake. Actual shaking, not the controlled tremor of effort but the involuntary response of a body processing threat. She gripped the metal railing, knuckles white, and breathed through it the way she'd learned to breathe through everything, measured, methodical, refusing to surrender to the response. That night, the overnight shift began at 10 o'clock. Hargrove was gone, replaced by Dr. Patel, who carried none of his malice. Rachel worked quietly, checking vitals, updating charts, staying out of the way. The ER hummed with its usual midnight rhythm, the controlled chaos of accidents and emergencies and the walking wounded who waited in plastic chairs for someone to help them. At 2 a.m., she passed room 4. Marcus Davis sat in his wheelchair by the window, silhouetted against the Denver night sky. 16 years old, paralyzed from T8 down after an IED blast had severed his spinal column somewhere in a place called Marja 20 miles from forward operating base Shank. 5 different doctors had given his father the same diagnosis: permanent. Irreversible. Accept it and move on. Rachel stopped in the doorway. Something inside her chest tightened at the sight of him, the same tightening she felt when she held those worn combat boots in her hands late at night in her apartment, the one she'd never been able to return. "Can't sleep either?" she asked quietly. Marcus glanced at her, then back at the window. "Sergeant Major Davis, my dad, he keeps asking when I'll walk again. 5 different doctors told him I won't. Ever." His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd already grieved a future that hadn't happened yet. "Dr. Hargrove is pretty much done trying at this point." Rachel leaned against the door frame. She could see the slope of Marcus's shoulders, the way his hands rested in his lap, the hollowness behind his eyes. She'd seen it before, 20 years ago, in a child pulled from rubble with blood in his hair and the weight of survival already written across his face. "Doctors don't know everything," she said. Marcus turned his head. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, not hope exactly, but the memory of what hope felt like. "You sound like my dad," he said. "He doesn't give up either." Rachel nodded and continued past his room, but something had shifted inside her. The calculation that had been running beneath all of Hargrove's humiliation suddenly became clear. He was testing her, measuring her, trying to determine exactly how much pressure it would take to make her break. He'd been precise and methodical because he'd recognized something in her response to his insults, something that told him she wasn't ordinary. What he didn't know was that the quietest person in a room was often the one holding everything together. The next morning, Rachel arrived 20 minutes early. In the break room, she found Hargrove with Dr. Chen, Dr. Okafor, Dr. Stevens, and Dr. Park, all reviewing Marcus's overnight scans on a light box. The images glowed pale blue, showing the delicate branching of his spinal cord and the dark space where the blast had severed it. The silence in the room had weight. "The seizure activity is increasing," Dr. Chen said, pointing to something on the scan Rachel couldn't quite see from the doorway. "We should discuss palliative options with the family." Hargrove nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions were coming true. "Agreed. The sergeant major needs to accept reality." Rachel froze in the doorway, coffee cup halfway to her lips. Her hands went steady, that automatic response from years of controlling everything that could be controlled. The hospital hallway behind her continued its normal rhythm, but inside the break room, 5 doctors had just decided that Marcus Davis would never walk again. The overnight shift at Mercy General had a different rhythm, quieter, emptier, the kind of silence that let you breathe if you weren't afraid of what you'd hear. Rachel moved through the corridors with her head level, avoiding the trauma bay where Dr. Hargrove sometimes lingered past midnight, reviewing charts with the intensity of a man who couldn't let anything slip beyond his control. She'd learned his patterns over 2 days. She kept to the south wing, the older patient floors, the places where his authority felt distant. Room 4 was on the 2nd level. Rachel had walked past it 100 times during her shifts, but she'd never stopped. The file read Marcus Davis, paralyzed, spinal cord injury, 14 days post-injury, prognosis guarded. Tonight, at 2 in the morning, she heard something through the cracked door that made her pause, not a sound, exactly, but the absence of one. No television. No phone. No rustling of sheets. Just the mechanical breathing of a ventilator and the soft, hollow rhythm of a monitor tracking a heart that was still beating but seemed to be asking itself why. She pushed the door open. Marcus sat upright in the hospital bed, his torso rigid with the kind of bracing that came from metal rods and bolts fused to what remained of his spine. His hands lay flat against the blanket, pale and motionless. He was staring out the window at the Denver night sky, where the city lights drowned out most of the stars. He couldn't turn his head. His eyes moved, that was all. Just the eyes, tracking something beyond the glass that only he could see. Rachel approached the bed slowly. She didn't announce herself with the bright, false cheer that other nurses used. She just sat in the chair beside him, the vinyl crinkling softly under her weight, and waited. The kind of waiting she'd learned in field hospitals in Marja, where some people needed medicine and others needed someone to sit with them while they decided whether surviving was worth the effort. "You're not supposed to be in here," Marcus said. His voice was thin, careful, like he was rationing each word. "Why not?" Rachel asked. Dr. Hargrove said I need to rest. Not talk. Not see people. Hargrove says a lot of things, Rachel said quietly. She wasn't dismissing the doctor, she understood the medicine behind isolating a catastrophic spinal injury, limiting stimulation that could raise intracranial pressure. But she also understood something else. Something about the weight of being alone with what you'd become. Marcus's eye shifted toward her. Are you the temp? She nodded. Rachel. They call you that. The temp. I hear them in the hallway. He paused. His jaw tightened. My dad calls me Marcus. The doctors call me or the patient. Hargrove calls me a complex case. He breathed in through his nose, a slow, controlled breath. I don't know who I am anymore. Rachel leaned forward, her forearms on her knees. Her hands, scarred at the knuckles and along the lifeline of her palms, hung between her legs. She'd held intestines together in the field. She'd applied a tourniquet to a severed leg while rounds came overhead. But this, sitting with a 16-year-old boy who'd gone to sleep as one person and woken up as someone else, this required a different kind of steady. You're Marcus, she said. That part hasn't changed. Everything's changed, he said. I can't move. I can't feel anything below my shoulders. Doctor said 5% chance I'll ever walk again. One of them actually laughed. Thought nobody noticed, but I did. He laughed like it was funny that 5% was all I got. Rachel didn't correct the math. She'd heard the doctors in the hallway. She'd read between the lines of their charts. The odds were worse than that. But she'd also learned that sometimes the wrong number was kinder than the right one. Do you believe in second chances? Marcus asked suddenly. The question came out of nowhere, desperate, like he'd been holding it in for days and couldn't anymore. Rachel thought about the combat boots in her locker. 20 years old. Salt-stained. Scuffed at the heel. She'd carried them through 6 moves, 3 different cities, and a decade of trying to disappear into normalcy. That was a second chance, the chance to be someone nobody was looking for. I do, she said. I do believe in them. How? How is there a second chance for me? His eyes filled, but he didn't blink. He was learning fast, you couldn't cry if you couldn't wipe your face. I'm 16. I was supposed to go to Stanford. I was supposed to run track. My dad, he's a Marine. Sergeant Major. He fought in wars. And I can't even sit up without help. Rachel stood. She moved to the window and looked out at the same darkness he'd been staring into. The lights of Denver glowed like a held breath. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping, running, choosing their own next moment. And in this room, a boy was trying to decide whether tomorrow was worth showing up for. Your father ever tell you about the worst day of his life? Rachel asked. No. Most parents don't, she said. She turned back to him. But they have them. Days where everything they thought they were got broken. Days where the math didn't work out. And somehow, they're still here. Still fighting. Not because the odds got better. Because they decided the fight itself was the point. She sat back down. That's what a second chance looks like. Not better odds. Just the decision to show up anyway. Marcus was quiet for a long time. The ventilator hissed and wheezed. The monitor beeped its steady count, 84 beats per minute, a heart still insisting on a future. Will you stay? He asked. Yes, Rachel said. She stayed through her break. She read to him from a book of short stories that had been gathering dust on his bedside table. His mother must have left it. She read about a man who learned to sail after losing his legs. About a woman who climbed mountains after a stroke. About people who woke up as different versions of themselves and decided to be heroes anyway. Marcus listened. He didn't speak much. But his eye stayed on her face, and that was enough. For now, that was enough. At 3:45, Rachel heard the elevator doors open on the south wing. Footsteps, heavy, measured, the gait of someone used to bearing weight that went beyond body mass. She stood slowly, leaving the book on the blanket. Through the crack in the door, she caught sight of a Marine in dress blues at 3 in the morning, medals arranged across his chest like a constellation. Sergeant Major Robert Davis. 15 years older than she remembered. Heavier. His hair more silver than black. But the shape of him, the way he moved through the hallway like a man carrying the weight of every decision he'd ever made, that was unmistakable. Her breathing went shallow. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs, a physical act of keeping everything in. The combat boots in her locker suddenly felt heavier, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for 2 decades, accumulating gravity. He stopped at the nursing station. She heard him ask about Marcus's condition. She heard the night nurse, Valerie, say something about the doctor's concerns. She heard him ask to see his son, and heard Valerie explain that visiting hours had technically ended, but given his rank and the circumstances, she'd turn a blind eye. Military father, paralyzed kid, the hospital staff had decided that rules were sometimes less important than mercy. Rachel stepped back from the door. She moved to the opposite side of room 4, pressing herself into the corner where the shadows lived. Sergeant Major Davis appeared in the doorway, and Rachel watched through the thin slice of visibility as he moved to his son's bedside. He didn't cry. He didn't fall apart. He just took Marcus's hand, carefully, so carefully, like his hands might break something that was already shattered, and stood there breathing. Rachel turned away. She had 17 minutes left on her break. She had 1,000 floors to clean and charts to review. She had a role to play, and that role did not include standing in corners watching fathers hold on to sons who couldn't hold back. But her heart was moving like a trapped animal, and she couldn't quite catch her breath, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Mercy General, she understood that the past wasn't something you left behind. It was something that waited. It was something that showed up at 3 in the morning in dress blues and medals and the kind of grief that only a warrior could carry. The code alarm screams at 4:07 a.m., tearing through the quiet of Mercy General's 3rd floor like something alive and hunting. The sound is primal, a wail designed by engineers who understood that some moments demand more than human voices can provide. In room 4, Marcus Davis's body convulses against the restraints of the hospital bed, his spine arching in a way spines were never meant to bend. Seizure. Not the small focal kind that sometimes comes with spinal injuries, but the kind that fills the room with a terrible electricity. Sergeant Major Robert Davis is pressed against the far wall by 2 nurses who understand that fathers have a tendency to rush toward danger when their children are dying. His jaw is clenched so tightly his face has gone the color of old concrete. He doesn't struggle. Warriors know the difference between the things they can fight and the things they can only witness. His eyes are locked on his son with an intensity that could melt steel, watching the boy's body betray him in ways that morphine and physical therapy could never prevent. 5 doctors arrive within 90 seconds. They move with the choreography of people who have done this before, competent, methodical, practiced. Dr. Henderson, the attending neurologist, reads the situation in a single glance and issues orders with the clarity of someone who has learned that precision saves lives. A resident pushes 2 milligrams of midazolam through the 4 line. Another doctor applies electrodes to Marcus's chest, tracking the electrical storm in his brain through the fuzzy telemetry screen that suddenly dominates the upper corner of the room. The seizure tremors continue. They don't stop. 3 minutes. 4. Rachel stands in the doorway, having been one of the first responders when the alarm fired. She watches with the particular stillness of someone trained to see patterns others miss. The doctors are doing everything right by the textbook, everything according to protocol, everything that should work. But Marcus's oxygen saturation is falling. 75. 71. The pulse oximeter's rhythm becomes a metronome counting down something nobody wants to count down. Then she sees it. The subtle shift in Marcus's right chest wall during the forced ventilation. A lag between left and right. A collapse that shouldn't be there. A tension pneumothorax, air trapped in his pleural space, pressing his right lung flat, crushing his heart's ability to fill properly. The 5 doctors miss it because they're looking at what should be there, at the protocols that should be working. Rachel sees what's actually happening, a complication stacked on top of the original injury, a secondary catastrophe building in real time. The cardiac monitor shows it too, if anyone is looking at the right numbers. Heart rate climbing toward 160. Blood pressure dropping past 80 systolic. The body's way of screaming that something is critically, immediately wrong. Dr. Henderson is calling for additional sedation, preparing for intubation if the seizure hasn't resolved in another minute. Good decisions. Wrong problem. Rachel steps into the room. It's not a question. It's not a hesitation. Every part of her, the muscle memory from 17 years ago in Marja, from 72 hours without sleep saving 47 lives in a Humvee with no power and no backup, recognizes the moment that separates action from paralysis. Tension pneumo, she says quietly, to no one in particular, and moves toward the supply cart. Dr. Hargrove's voice comes like a shovel striking stone. What did you say? Right side. Collapsed lung. Air in the pleural space. He straightens, his eyes narrowing into something that looks almost delighted. You're a nurse. You observe. You report. You do not diagnose. Rachel opens the needle decompression kit with movements that are smooth and automatic. Hands that have held intestines in place during mortar fire now steady the 14-gauge angiocath needle like it weighs nothing. The kit spreads open under her fingers, antiseptic pad, needle, everything arranged exactly where her training muscle memory expects it. If you touch him, I will have your license, Dr. Hargrove says, and there's something almost satisfied in his voice, like he's been waiting for a moment like this, something concrete enough to destroy her with. You practice medicine without a license, you're finished. Actually finished. Not just fired. Prosecuted. Rachel locates the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Anatomical landmarks written into her body from 100 trauma surgeries in spaces with names like Phi Base Phoenix and Sanjan Valley. She doesn't look at Hargrove. She doesn't look at the 5 doctors now turning to watch her, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. She looks at Marcus, whose oxygen saturation has dropped to 68 and is still falling, whose heart is struggling to maintain rhythm under the mechanical crush of trapped air, whose father has gone absolutely motionless against the wall because hope and desperation have frozen him into silence. Rachel rips open Marcus's gown with the same efficiency she would use to open a door. The boy's pale chest is exposed to the fluorescent glare and the stale hospital air. His skin is cool, beginning to show the subtle mottling of severe shock. There is no time for permission. There is no time for hierarchy. There is only oxygen saturation of 68 and a countdown that operates in seconds, not minutes. The needle penetrates skin, then muscle, then the fascial resistance of the external intercostal membrane. She pushes through pleura, and the room fills with the hiss of air escaping under pressure, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure valves opening, like the sound of something that was crushing the body finally releasing its grip. 40 seconds. That's the entire sequence. Recognition to decompression. Decision to needle to the sudden gasp of air escaping and the immediate change in Marcus's body as the pressure equalizes, as his right lung begins to re-expand, as his oxygen saturation begins its climb. 70. 75. 82. 88. The seizure stops. Marcus's body goes still, the convulsions ceasing as suddenly as they began. His eyes flutter, once, twice, and then they open, clouded but present, aware, alive. They find Rachel's face and lock there for one moment that stretches like rope. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. The message is written in his pupils, in the return of consciousness, in the fact that his breathing and his oxygen saturation is climbing steadily toward normal. His father steps away from the wall, moved by some combination of hope and gratitude and disbelief. The nurses who were restraining him move away almost without thinking. Sergeant Major Davis takes one step, then another, toward his son and the nurse who just pulled him back from the edge of a death that no amount of military protocol can prevent. The ER erupts like something that was holding its breath and finally exhales. Some of the doctors look shocked. Some look horrified. Some look at Rachel with the particular expression of people watching a line be crossed in real time, not by them, not with permission, but by someone who calculated that the rules mattered less than the outcome. Dr. Hargrove's face goes purple, the color rising from his neck like someone has opened a valve. His hands are shaking as he reaches for his phone. Not a request. Not a conversation. He's already dialing as he turns away from the bed, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the room with the weight of someone who has just found the weapon he's been searching for. This is Dr. Richard Hargrove at Mercy General in Denver. I need to speak to the hospital board president. Immediately. We have a situation involving a temp nurse practicing medicine without a license. I need her credentials pulled. Now. No, I'm not exaggerating. She just performed an emergency needle decompression on a pediatric patient without authorization, without medical training beyond the RN license, without so much as a consultation with the attending physicians. Rachel steps back from the bed, her hands coming up in the universal gesture of surrender. But her hands aren't shaking from fear. They're trembling from adrenaline, from the intensity of what her body just did, from the muscle memory that was never supposed to activate outside a combat zone. She's been trained to survive. She's been trained to heal. She's never been trained to do those things quietly, invisibly, without disrupting the careful hierarchies of the institutions that employ her. Within 20 minutes, 2 administrators arrive at the ER in clothes that are too formal for the hour. Their faces carry the particular expression of people handling a crisis they don't fully understand. Within an hour, Dr. Hargrove has activated his network with the precision of someone who has been planning this escalation. He calls in favors from 3 board members, men who remember the times he covered their mistakes, their inappropriate decisions, their failures of judgment that he turned into administrative silence. He contacts Rachel's references at Quickstaff, the temporary nursing agency, and they know nothing about her except that she was assigned to Mercy General and that some of the other temp workers mentioned she seemed withdrawn. The state board investigator arrives by 9 a.m. Dr. Hargrove produces documents, incident reports, performance concerns, behavioral red flags, all hastily assembled into a narrative of a nurse operating outside her scope, a woman who showed signs of instability from her first shift. The cafeteria incident. The bet with the orderlies. All of it reframed as evidence of poor judgment, boundary dissolution, a pattern of reckless decision-making that culminated in practicing medicine without a license. By 10:41 a.m., security escorts Rachel to the HR department on the 2nd floor. Patricia, the director, is a thin woman in her 50s with the exhausted expression of someone who has fired too many people for reasons that were never entirely their fault. She slides termination papers across her desk with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a choreography she's performed too many times. Dr. Hargrove has expressed serious concerns about your scope of practice, Patricia says, not meeting Rachel's eyes. The hospital administration has decided that it's in everyone's best interest to terminate your contract effective immediately. Rachel signs the papers without argument. Fighting means questions. Questions mean they dig deeper, find the gaps in her story, discover that the nursing license is real but the psychiatric evaluation she was assigned to complete in San Diego never happened because she got on a bus instead. They'll find out she fled her naval commission with nothing but a single folded letter of resignation, that she's technically AWOL from a mandatory psych evaluation, that the nightmares became so severe that holding a scalpel in a hospital felt safer than holding one in her dreams. She stands and walks out of HR with a security guard at her elbow, a young man who looks apologetic, who probably doesn't know what he's actually guarding against. Down the hallway. Down the stairs. Through the ER toward the employee exit, passing room 4, where Sergeant Major Davis is sitting beside his son, Marcus, awake and breathing and alive because of a decision Rachel made in 40 seconds, consequences and all. Their eyes meet for exactly 1 moment as she passes. The Sergeant Major's expression is unreadable, shock, perhaps, or the particular stillness of someone trying to process a miracle and its cost simultaneously. Then she's moving again, moving toward the door, toward the parking lot, toward the life that's waiting for her in a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one knows that she can do what she just did. At 11:06 p.m., her 10-year-old daughter Sophia finds her sitting at the kitchen table still wearing the coffee-stained scrubs. The kitchen is dark except for the small light over the stove. Rachel's face is pressed into her hands, her shoulders moving with the kind of quiet crying that comes from people who have learned not to make sound, because sound in the darkness has always meant danger. "Mommy." Sophia's voice is small, confused, carrying the particular concern of children who have learned that their parents are not always safe. "Why are you home early? You work tonight." Rachel looks up at her daughter and sees everything she's trying to protect: innocence, stability, a future that doesn't include the knowledge of what her mother actually is, what her mother was trained to do, the terrible mathematics of keeping people alive in impossible situations. She pulls Sophia close without answering, whispers something into her daughter's hair that isn't quite a prayer and isn't quite a confession. "I made a choice, baby. I just hope it was the right one." The room exploded. Dr. Hargrove's face went white for exactly 2 seconds, the moment his brain caught up to what had just happened, what Rachel had just done in front of him, in front of the entire trauma team, in front of Marcus Davis's father who was staring at his son's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 88 like watching a miracle happen in real time. Then the white turned crimson. The vein in his temple began to pulse like a second heartbeat. "Get her out of my hospital," he said quietly to the nearest resident. Not a request. A command issued through gritted teeth. But he wasn't finished. Not even close. Within 4 minutes, Hargrove was on his personal cell in the physician's lounge, his voice steady now, the anger compressed into something far more dangerous: strategy. He called the hospital board president, Mr. Gunderson, a man who owed Hargrove 3 favors from a very profitable consulting arrangement. "We have a critical patient safety issue," Hargrove said. A temp nurse, unlicensed, unvetted, just performed an emergency needle decompression without authorization. She endangered that patient's life. We need her credentials pulled. Now. He hung up before Gunderson could ask questions. Then he called his personal lawyer, Marcus Bennett, and his backup counsel, a woman named Diane Pierce who specialized in hospital liability. Both calls lasted exactly 90 seconds each. Hargrove laid out his narrative with surgical precision: rogue nurse, overstepped scope, forged references, patient endangered. He told them to prepare documentation immediately. The calls that followed were the ones that mattered most. Hargrove had spent 8 years building alliances at Mercy General, 3 administrators who'd received gifts to his favorite charities, 2 board members who voted his way on salary reviews, a compliance officer who looked the other way on his billing practices. These were not casual relationships. These were transactions. And Hargrove was calling them in, all of them, simultaneously. To Administrator Chu, he said, "I need you to flag her medical records. Cross-reference her claimed credentials with the licensing board. I guarantee they won't match. She's a fraud." To Dr. Westfield, the chief of medicine, "I'm concerned about a serious breach in our hiring protocols. Someone needs to launch an internal investigation before this becomes a joint commission issue." To board member Simmons, "I'd like to file a formal complaint with state medical oversight. This temp nurse needs to be investigated immediately for practicing outside her scope. The network activated like a machine built specifically for this purpose. Because it had been. Hargrove had built it deliberately, piece by piece, investment by investment. Within 40 minutes, the hospital's compliance office had pulled Rachel's employment file and cross-referenced it against her stated qualifications. Rachel Torres, RN, licensed in Colorado since 2015. No advanced certifications. No critical care training listed. No specialized trauma designation. The gap between what she'd just done and what her paperwork claimed she was qualified to do was cavernous. Hargrove had already anticipated the question the compliance officer would ask: "Doctor, how did she even know to perform that procedure?" His answer was ready: "I have no idea." Which is exactly the problem. State investigators were notified within 2 hours. A woman named Special Agent Sarah Morrison from the Colorado Medical Board's Complaint and Investigation Division received a call from the hospital's risk management team. The allegation was clinical negligence, scope of practice violation, and potential fraud in credentialing. Morrison had seen this before: ambitious nurses who overreached, who thought a few YouTube videos or battlefield experience meant they could practice emergency medicine. She scheduled an interview for the next morning. But Hargrove wasn't waiting for morning. He was moving faster now, consolidating his position before Rachel could mount any defense. He called the temp agency that had placed her, a Cleveland-based outfit called Healthcare Solutions Plus, and requested their complete file on Rachel Torres, claiming he needed to verify her references for insurance purposes. The agency manager, nervous about liability, sent everything immediately: 2 reference letters, both of which Hargrove had prepared himself weeks ago under false names and mailed from a UPS store in downtown Denver. The references were impeccable. They were also completely fabricated. But Rachel didn't know that yet. Rachel was still in the ER, still in her scrubs, still feeling the phantom pressure of Marcus's chest under her hands, still hearing his father's voice, "You saved my son," when the administrative assistant from HR appeared in the trauma bay doorway and asked to speak with her privately. The walk to the HR office took 45 seconds. Rachel was still moving on muscle memory from the resuscitation, her hands trembling very slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash, the body's way of releasing what the mind refused to process. She kept her breathing controlled, her pace measured. In the HR office, a woman named Patricia Moe sat behind a laminate desk with a manila folder and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm going to need your employee badge and credentials," Patricia said quietly. "Effective immediately. You're being terminated for violation of scope of practice and conducting medical procedures without proper authorization." Rachel didn't flinch. The patient was in cardiac arrest. Tension pneumothorax. 5 minutes without intervention, Anne. "I understand what you did medically," Patricia interrupted. "But you're not credentialed to make that call. The hospital's legal team is very clear. You perform procedures reserved for physicians. Regardless of outcome, that's grounds for immediate termination." Hargrove had already submitted the termination letter to Patricia's inbox. It was dated, signed, and attached to a memo from the hospital's risk management director: "In light of patient safety concerns, we recommend immediate separation." Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers, neither of whom looked at Rachel directly as they walked her to the staff exit. The parking lot was visible through the glass doors, the place where she'd arrived 6 hours ago as a temp nurse, hoping to prove herself, hoping that maybe Denver could be different, that maybe she could build a life here without her past catching up. The doors locked behind her with a soft pneumatic hiss, like the sound of a closing fist. That night, her apartment was quiet in the way that only empty spaces after catastrophe can be quiet. Sophia was already asleep on the couch, her homework scattered across the coffee table, her backpack still on, suggesting she'd come home from school and simply surrender to exhaustion. Rachel stood in the kitchen doorway for 5 minutes just watching her daughter sleep, unable to move, unable to process. She sat at the kitchen table in her stained scrubs, Marcus's blood still dark on the cuff, she realized now, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd worn a child's blood out of a hospital while being escorted out by security. She put her head down on the table and her shoulders began to move without sound, her body betraying the composure her mind had maintained for 16 hours straight. That was when Sophia woke up. That was when her 10-year-old daughter, groggy and confused, padded into the kitchen in her purple dinosaur pajamas and found her mother crying at the table, still in her work scrubs, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and failure. "Mommy." Sophia's voice was small, uncertain, the voice of a child who'd learned not to ask too many questions about why her mother sometimes disappeared into herself. "Why are you home early?" Rachel lifted her head. She looked at her daughter's face, dark eyes like her own, the slight furrow between her brows that meant she was worried, genuinely worried, about her mother. Sophia deserved an answer. She deserved the truth. She deserved to understand why her mother came home at 2:38 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon instead of 7:22 p.m., why her uniform was stained with blood, why she was crying at the kitchen table like something inside her had finally broken. But the truth was a classified military file locked in a Pentagon database. The truth was a rank that Rachel had surrendered 20 years ago, a name that didn't belong to the woman sitting in this kitchen. The truth was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had saved 47 lives on the operating table in Fallujah, that she'd held intestines and femoral arteries and shattered skulls steady in hands that had learned to be instruments of precision under fire, that she'd earned a Navy Cross and 3 Bronze Stars with valor for procedures performed in the dark while mortar rounds shook the tent around her. The truth was that she'd fled all of it. She'd abandoned her rank, her uniform, her identity, because her hands had started to shake during routine surgeries, because she couldn't sleep more than 90 minutes without waking from dreams of screaming patients, because the weight of everyone she couldn't save had finally bent her past the breaking point. She'd become Rachel Torres, RN, the invisible temp nurse, the woman no one remembered, the ghost who moved through hospitals leaving no trace. And now even that life was gone. "I made a mistake at work, sweetheart," Rachel whispered, and it was the only true thing she could say. "And I have to figure out how to fix it." Sophia climbed into her lap, still half asleep, and Rachel held her daughter and let her cry silently into the child's hair, breathing in the smell of strawberry shampoo and childhood, both of which suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Outside, Denver was already moving on to the next crisis, the next emergency. But in this kitchen, in this moment, Rachel understood that her anonymity, the careful fiction she'd constructed, the identity she'd buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot who she actually was, had finally collapsed. And once a secret starts to unravel, once the threads begin to pull loose, there's no stopping what comes unwound. Sergeant Major Robert Davis was sitting in his son's hospital room, Marcus sleeping peacefully now, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 94, his color returning, when a nurse he'd never seen before handed him a discharge summary and Marcus's hospital directory folder. "Someone asked me to make sure you got this," the nurse said quietly. Then she was gone. Inside the folder was a handwritten note, Rachel Torres, RN. Extension for 427. And beneath it, in different handwriting, much older, something that made the sergeant major's breath catch, Reaper. 2004, Amaja. That was when everything changed. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when warriors are finally recognized for who they really are. What would you have done in Rachel's position? And when you find out what happens next, come back and let me know in the comments, because this story isn't over yet. Not even close.